Soviet space engineers struggled throughout the 60s to beat America to the moon. It was a frantic race, and a losing one too.
The Americans were pulling ahead in the space race. So the Soyouz program was the way they're going to surpass the entire Gemini program in a single mission. But to do that, they had to push and push and push. It was absolutely crazy.
Not just crazy, but deadly dangerous. And 4 courageous astronauts paid the price for their master's follies. From the launch of the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, through the exploits of the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, the Russian space program seemed to soar ahead of its American rival. The Soviet Union relished its worldwide acclaim. Gagarin achieved instant hero status in a contest which Khrushchev and the Kremlin were desperate to win.
It mattered to the Russians to get to the moon first. It was really a conflict of ideologies. Which was the superior ideology, capitalism or communism? And particularly for the communists, they really wanted to prove that they were superior.
An elite corps of cosmonauts was selected for specialized training. Not totally elite. One of them was later sacked for being drunk. By March 1965, Russia could still claim a slight lead. Alexei Leonov became the first man to walk in space. His 20-minute outing just pipped the American Ed White to the post. Soviet doctors heavily influenced the choice of the pioneer cosmonauts, older and heavier than their American counterparts. But like the American astronauts, the first cosmonauts were basically test pilots. One top pilot just missed the first flights. He didn't have to wait long. Vladimir Komarov soon excelled, and in October 1964 he was commander of a 3-man crew who performed 16 orbits in the Voskhod 1 spacecraft.
Komarov was one of the most senior of the early cosmonauts. Not just a very healthy test pilot, but an intelligent man, highly educated, and the man who'd commanded the first crew in space on the previous 3-man Voskhod flight. So he was clearly the most senior and the most capable of their cosmonauts.
Komarov, like his predecessor Gagarin, was greeted with adulation on his return to Moscow. But behind the triumph lay turmoil. The Russians were looking over their shoulders.
The Russian program was under tremendous pressure because the American side had gained force and gained power in reaction to the initial space race. There had been 10 American Gemini flights in the past 2 years. So the U.S. program was maturing and picking up steam. The Russians had to try and keep pace because they had to keep the impression of them being in the lead.
Russia's progress so far had depended too much on one man, Sergei Korolev, their master space designer.
The Russian space program did have a problem in that the chief designer, Sergei Korolev, had died in 1966, and there was nobody with his personality who could actually fight the Russian political bureaucracy.
Technically, the Russians were in a very good state. They had a lot of good designers, they had a lot of experience. In terms of people, they actually probably had more people working on it than the Americans had working on Apollo. But in terms of their command economy, this undoubtedly caused them problems. The design bureaus, who were sort of the mainstay in this process, could place orders for particular goods, but they couldn't be sure that they would necessarily get the goods they required at the time they required them, or even that they would necessarily be of the quality they required, a typical problem of a centralized command economy.
Progress may have been fitful. It was still progress. Vostok and Voskhod were succeeded by the new, more sophisticated Soyouz spacecraft.
Soyouz was the second-generation spacecraft, which had much more capability than Vostok. Vostok really was shot up and went round and couldn't do much about it apart from control its attitude. Soyouz could maneuver. It had an engine, it had solar panels for electricity, it could stay up for much more than Vostok, whose longest flight was 5 or 6 days.
The Soyouz spacecraft had 3 parts. At the front was the orbital module, which was the basic working area for the crew. Next to this came the command module, where the crew sat during launch and landing, controlling the flight. Finally, there was the service module, the part which stored the fuel, engines and batteries. Just after leaving orbit, the service module dropped off, with the orbital following a few seconds later. Only the command module remained.
The purpose of the Soyuz 1 mission was combined with the purpose of the Soyuz 2 mission to be launched a day later. They were going to dock the two spacecraft, and cosmonauts were going to transfer from Soyuz 2 into Soyuz 1. Soyuz 1 would then return to the ground. Soyuz 2 would return a bit later.
The one-man ship comes back, and the three-man ship now spends 10 days in space, or even longer, breaking the rest of the Gemini records. As they promised, this one mission was going to surpass all 10 of the previous Gemini flights and re-establish Russia as the leader in the space race.
The first attempts to get Soyuz into space were not very encouraging.
The first one had gone off course on re-entry and had to be blown up to stop it from landing in China. The second one, the launcher, had blown up on the pad, that they managed to salvage the capsule. And the third one, the heat shield burnt through on re-entry. The capsule was damaged and it landed in the Aral Sea and had to be recovered from under the ice there. So it certainly wasn't an unmitigated series of successes before they tried to launch Soyuz 1.
The pressure to do it, especially to do it before the May 1st holiday, was intense. And without Korolev, without the former chief designer, no one else apparently in the program had the backbone to stand up to the politicians and say, no, we can't do it.
On April the 23rd, 1967, Soyuz was deemed ready for its mission. An unhappy Komarov was the one crewman.
The reports are that on the day of the launch, Komarov had an air of resignation, it's described as. This may be something to do with the fact that it was reported that there were something like 210 faults on the Soyuz spacecraft that needed rectifying before it could be launched. But there were a couple of his cosmonaut buddies along with him, and apparently, they started trying to cheer him up, slapping him on the back, singing songs. And by the time he climbed into the capsule, he was apparently quite hale and hearty.
Just after midnight, GMT, Soyuz 1 took off, bearing the hopes for Soviet supremacy in space. The scale of Soviet ambition was breathtaking. In just 72 hours, the spacewalk and the transfer of the crew in space would put Russia right back in front in the race to the moon. One particular feature differentiated the Russian Soyuz spacecraft from the American Apollo. It was the use of solar panels to power the ship once in orbit.
The Soyuz spacecraft was using solar panels as the primary method of generating electricity on board the spacecraft. The Americans had experimented with fuel cells on the Gemini spacecraft, which were perfectly good for flights of up to about 14 days or so. The Russians were hoping to fly longer missions than that, and rather than use fuel cells, they decided that solar panels were the way to go.
Hardly had Soyuz 1 got into space when the mission found itself already in jeopardy. A serious fault occurred with those solar panels.
The solar panels are supposed to open on the very first orbit, in the first hour of flight. They open like the wings of a seagull to soak up solar energy. One opened, the other one didn't. For the next couple hours, actually, Komarov on board was banging away at the wall with his feet, trying to shake the array loose. It never came loose.
To the outside world, nothing was amiss with this historic mission. Komarov sent his greetings to the Russian people from space, but betrayed nothing of the mounting tensions surrounding the flight. Only years later did stories emerge of a sobbing Komarov bidding farewell to his wife. Today, this is discounted as ghoulish exaggeration, for although Komarov was in trouble, the trouble wasn't yet terminal. He could still be saved.
The breakdowns on the Soyuz were serious enough to cancel the second mission. They tried to work on the solar array, they tried to work on other things that were breaking, and they were not working. They'd canceled the next flight. Their concentration then was on getting Komarov back alive.
The purpose of the mission had been a secret. So was the reason for its curtailment. Komarov was returning after just 16 orbits.
The spacecraft was not getting enough electricity. This caused the astronavigation system to malfunction. They had a lot of problems with stabilizing the spacecraft early on. As a result of this, when they eventually decided to bring Komarov back, they got the navigation system set up, and then the spacecraft went into eclipse, into the shadow of the Earth, and the astronavigation system stopped working completely. Komarov then had to effectively plan his own re-entry. He had to take a site on the moon to orientate the spacecraft and initiate the retro burn manually, thereby leading to a certain doubt about whether he would actually sort of succeed in hitting the correct re-entry corridor. As far as we can tell, he aligned himself completely correctly, initiated re-entry completely correctly. And what killed him was the final part of the mission, when he was a few miles up.
Leaving orbit, the spacecraft broke into its 3 parts. It would have gone through a layer of intense heat when communications would be lost. As the Earth's atmosphere thickened, the command module would slow down. 3 miles above the ground, 2 parachutes should emerge, a small one pulling out a much larger second one. Finally, solid rockets would fire just a few meters above the ground, giving the ship a soft landing. Cosmonauts underwent intense training to allow them to maneuver their craft manually in extreme conditions. Komarov performed well, but there is some speculation that, buffeted by tremendous gravitational pulls, he momentarily blacked out. We only know disaster followed.
When it started to come into the Earth's atmosphere, it was spinning instead of coming in cleanly. That meant that when the first parachute came out, the lines tangled. Komarov then deployed the backup parachute. The spacecraft was still spinning, and that tangled around the first parachute that came out and therefore did nothing to slow his speed. The spacecraft hit the ground at many hundreds of kilometers an hour. We don't know the exact speed. Shortly after impact on the ground, the solid propellant rockets at the base of the vehicle, which were intended to actually cushion the landing on a successful flight, exploded. The spacecraft caught fire and was completely destroyed.
Soyouz 1 plunged into the ground near the town of Orsk, close to the Ural Mountains. It was far, far off course. Soviet rescuers took hours to find the site, always keeping alive the lingering hope that somehow Vladimir Komarov might have survived. 2 days later, Komarov's remains were buried in the Kremlin wall. His eulogies were deserved.
Hero flyer, he who twice floated up in the immense cosmos. The members of the State Commission form the first guard of honor. The love of Soviet people to their sons' heroes is endless. Today it is expressed in tears, crepes, black ribbons and wreaths. People from the cosmical town say him their last goodbye, a goodbye to their brother.
There was serious shock at this disaster, and clearly looking at the causes of the disaster, the technical failures were one thing, the political pressure was another. And it may have given the Russian manned program at least a little bit of breathing space to make sure things were going to work right before they tried a manned flight again.
It pretty much put a stopper on them hoping to beat the Americans to the moon. They had to look at the design of their spacecraft. They couldn't continue with their Soyouz testing mission as they'd been planned. If they couldn't dock spacecraft effectively, they just couldn't go to the moon.
The Soviets may have failed to beat America to the moon, but they hadn't given up on space. A fresh tragedy was to rock their space program to its foundations. When Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, arguments ended about who had won the space race.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The Russians couldn't match the Apollo manned lunar landings, and they therefore decided to go down the road of having space stations in orbit.
The concept of a space station had always gripped the imagination, with ever more fantastic guesses at what one might look like. This was the result. Saljut.
The advantage of space stations was that the Russians could claim that this is what they'd been aiming at all along. They denied that they'd ever officially wanted to go to the moon. There never had been any space race, they said. This was what it was all about, you know, human occupation of space stations.
And in 1971, Saljut was duly sent into orbit on a Proton rocket.
Saljut was a small house trailer-sized object in space with a docking port in front, where the men could reach it, they could live on it, they could move around in it and carry out experiments and live on it for weeks and weeks and weeks.
But the Russian space engineers didn't just need to get Salyut aloft. They needed to get men inside it.
It wasn't long before they launched Soyouz 10 to go to Salyut 1. It docked, but something went wrong. They didn't go inside the space station. So after a day, they came back.
So it was on to Soyouz 11. The crew was not equipped with spacesuits. This was quite normal, but for these cosmonauts, normal practice was to have tragic and fatal consequences.
For the Soyuz missions, you could only actually get 2 cosmonauts into a Soyuz capsule in spacesuits at that time. If you wanted to get 3 in, they had to leave the spacesuits behind, and they were looking to get more work done at the space station. If you put 3 people up there, you can get 50% more work done.
The commander was Georgy Dobrovolsky, a war hero. Vladislav Volkov was senior engineer, and Viktor Patsayev the test engineer.
Part of the reason these people don't appear so strong in our memory is that they were the backup crew. They were not the original crew that was supposed to go, and only in the final days before launch were they put into the launch position. Now, there were 3 very experienced cosmonauts. One had flown in space before, one was a test pilot, a Ukrainian test pilot, and the other was a very experienced engineer who had worked on the development of this hardware. So they were a good crew. We just don't know much about them, and this is just very sad because they were the first real people aboard a space station, and they didn't live to tell the tale.
Soyouz 11 blasted into space just before 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, June the 6th, 1971. The assignment had gone to the backup crew only 2 days before the launch. One of the originally assigned crew had a lung infection. The first part of the mission was a startling success. Dobrovolsky navigated the last stages of the journey with great accuracy, so Soyouz was perfectly positioned for the nose-to-nose coupling with the orbiting space station. After 3 days, the crew's series of experiments became a highlight of Russian television.
For the Russians, this became a major media event because the crew were providing regular daily bulletins from orbit, showing how they were working in space, everything that they were doing, and basically they became television personalities within Russia.
The main thrust of their experiments was the investigation of the effects of microgravity on biological organisms. Up until that time, the longest anybody had been in space was, 15 days or so. If the Russians were really going to make a big thing of space stations, they wanted to keep people up there for months at a time, not just a couple of weeks.
It appears that the original flight plan was for 28 days in space, but the work was very hard up there. There was a fire on board that really rattled the crew. There were a number of other cases where things were just breaking down. There appeared to have been psychological stresses between various members of the crew. And so the decision was made after about 22, 23 days, that's enough. We've accomplished really all we need to. Let's just call the mission down a few days early and learn what we've learned from the flight.
Overall, the mission was going well. Prodigious amounts of data were transmitted back to Earth, keeping all the analysts busy. Then, after 342 orbits, they were ordered back. This was a complicated process which could only happen once a day when the flight path took them over Baikonur, Russia's space headquarters in Kazakhstan. Miss your chance and you would have to wait another 24 hours. Soyouz 11 started its return on June the 29th.
Once you're in space, to get back to Earth takes about two flights around the Earth, perhaps 3. You separate from the station, pull away, about an hour and a half later, you fire your rocket and head back to Earth. So it may take 3 to 4 hours to get back from the space station down to the Earth's surface.
The first step in the return journey is called retrofire. The spaceship is going backwards when it's in orbit. The rockets fire, slowing it down so it falls out of orbit. Unknown to those below, it was just then that triumph turned into terrible tragedy. Russian engineers confidently monitored Soyouz 11's return. They were preparing a glorious welcome. No one was alarmed at the crew's silence, or the sudden loss of the shortwave signals.
There were no radio signals from the Soyouz during the final descent by parachute, but that was fairly common. It was a matter of radio equipment often wouldn't work. It hit the ground, it landed softly, the capsule's over on the side, people ran up to it, expecting to congratulate the crew. My accounts that I've heard say that one of the ground technicians opened the hatch, reached inside to shake hands with the crew, and there were just 3 bodies huddled down at the bottom of the capsule.
All Russia was aghast at this shocking and totally unforeseen outcome. Desperate attempts to revive the cosmonauts were fruitless. They were long dead.
Subsequently, it was revealed that there is a valve in the Soyouz which equalizes the pressure inside the Soyouz with that outside while it's on the parachute coming down. So as it comes down into the atmosphere, you've got pressure inside the Soyouz, not got much atmospheric pressure outside. There's this gradual equalization of the pressure.
The air had rushed out from the faulty valve in the join of the command module and the orbital module.
What happened in this case was the pressure equalization valve leading from the command module to the outside air blew open when the front section of the command module was separated, leaving the valve open to space. The air leaked out within 30-40 seconds. The crew lost consciousness very quickly and died. The valve that killed them was still there in the spacecraft in the open position. So it was clear that that was what happened. It did not take long to isolate it. What was really shocking to them was that they discovered there were backup procedures they thought would protect them, procedures that involved manually cranking close that valve. But they discovered when they went back and checked the figures that it took 2 minutes to do that, and the valve would let all the air out in 30 seconds, and somebody had not made a connection.
For a second time, Russia was in a state of official mourning for heroes who had died in space. Patsayev had tried to close the valve and stop the air rushing out. It's believed he hit his face against a metal handle. A symbol of his despair, a bruise on his cheek, was there for all to see.
The first change was to add spacesuits, and that required taking the third seat of the ship and putting a space oxygen system, an air system in there that would feed air into the suits. They also did do other things to the spacecraft to make sure that if the air did leak out, they still could operate and get back down to the Earth fast enough. They did that, and of course they never had to do it again because they've had no further air leaks like that. But for years afterwards, only 2 men instead of 3 could fly aboard Russian spaceships.
The next planned Soyuz mission was cancelled. The Saljut 1 space station was abandoned. Design changes included removing the solar panels which had contributed to the first Soyuz disaster. The Russians kept their faith in space stations as the way forward in man's exploration of the universe. Even today, despite the troubled history of the Mir project, that faith looks justified.
Exploring myths and mysteries of the animal kingdom next on Discovery Channel, Animal X Premiere, looking at the legend of Puerto Rico's menacing goat sucker and the phantom black dogs of East Anglia.